Hi guys! First of all, I'm sorry, because the title of this video is ever so slightly clickbaity and maybe somewhat misleadingly provocative. I have 5 pairs of books to show you, or pairs of one book and one piece of entertainment of a different medium. And in each of these cases, the first item is a book that I disliked, or a book that I was disappointed in, or a book that I am not interested in the first place. And the second item is an alternative that I would like to describe to you today. However, the first items aren't always straight up anti-recommendations, and even in the cases in which they are, you could just as easily treat them as, if you liked this, you might also like that kind of recommendations. So it's not as negative or ranty a video as it might sound like. So without further ado, let's get into the recommendations. The first book for which I'd like to show you an alternative is The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Shaffer and Barrows. If, like me, you are interested in the topic of the German occupation of Guernsey, but this book sounds altogether too twee and oh so whimsical, and perhaps you don't fancy a contemporary commercial epistolary novel either, then I recommend to you Island Madness by Tim Binding. This is the book that I went to in the same situation. It is a book about what people do in times of war and occupation in order to stay alive and to keep themselves safe. But it is also about how some people will inevitably do just a little bit more than would strictly be necessary in order to stay afloat. And it's also about how sometimes your best efforts aren't enough to keep you safe. I haven't read the Potato Peel Pie Society book, but I'm pretty sure that this is a far less cozy and comforting read, and I guess that is why it gets pretty low ratings, but I thought it is fantastic. My second book that I would not recommend is The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. There is a Black Mirror episode that does it better. It's episode 2 of season 2 called White Bear, with Lenora Cricklow from Being Human and Tuppence Middleton from Sense8. It doesn't have exactly the same plot, but it has the same premise. And in fact, I've always wondered if this Black Mirror episode inspired the book. In any case, I think it's by far the better use of your time. My third book is The Gathering by Enright. This is the story of a large Irish family who come together at the old family home on the occasion of a funeral of a young man who committed suicide. All the siblings come together and the mother is there as well. And this is, of course, the perfect opportunity to do some soul searching and also to examine the family history and to ask what happened in the past, in the siblings' childhood, that ultimately alienated them from one another and the family home, and why their brother is or was such a disturbed man, and why the family home is such a miserable place. And of course, there is a shocking reveal towards the end, which you totally could not see coming from page 1. Oh no. This is a pretty well-liked and highly regarded book. I think it won the Booker Prize, or was it just shortlisted? No, I think it won. But I thought it was a total yawn and predictable from the first page to the last. And what I'd like to recommend in its stead is, again, a movie, and it is Monsoon Wedding. This is, as you might guess from the title, it's an Indian film, a Bollywood movie, but it only contains one dancing scene, and this is actually a musical performance at the wedding of the title. This is actually quite similar in premise to Anne Enright's The Gathering. Here as well, a large family gets together on the occasion of a wedding which they have to prepare, and while they're all cooped up together, tensions arise and the past is examined. But unlike The Gathering, this movie is so not a yawn. It is colorful without being shrill, it is dramatic without being melodramatic, and it's just 1.5 hours of good entertainment but with a serious turn. So, if like me, if you liked the premise of The Gathering but found it quite disappointing in its execution, maybe give this movie a try. My fourth item is Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. If you'd like to read about an epic journey through the Scottish Highlands, but you're not really that keen on thousands and thousands of pages of cheesy romantic melodrama written by an American, I recommend Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. This gets a classic ticked off your list as well. I'm not sure how well known the plot of this one is. This is the story of David Balfour, who is a young gentleman from Edinburgh who has recently inherited the big family house, but who gets cheated out of this inheritance by an evil uncle who sells him off into slavery. But the ship on which David is held captive and which is supposed to take him to the Americas, the ship encounters some difficulties, and in the end it capsizes and David is swept ashore, and he then has to fight his way from the Isle of Mull all the way across the country back to Edinburgh. And that means traveling on foot through what is basically enemy territory for David and somewhat of a war zone, because we are in the middle of the Jacobite rebellion. But David makes a friend early on in the young Highlander and Jacobite Alan Breck, and this friendship is both a blessing and a curse for David, because on the one hand, Alan knows his way around. He knows the land, he knows the people, he has wilderness skills, but on the other hand, he is a known criminal and is looked for by the English army who patrol the countryside. And traveling with him, David gets treated as guilty by association, and the two of them always have to dodge these patrols. So David has to walk quite a few miles in the shoes of his political adversary, and this of course proves very educational for him, because he sees what the world looks like for men like Alan Breck. This gets categorized as a children's book, but I didn't know that when I first read it, and it didn't read like one for me. I mean, sure, it's a coming-of-age novel, and it's an adventure novel, but it has, well, to say it has serious political undertones is quite an exaggeration. It is quite a political and quite serious novel, besides also being quite a romp and just a great fun adventure story. It straight away went up onto my list of my favorite books of all time, and I've wondered all day why the hell I have never read anything else by Robert Louis Stevenson. And the last book for which I have an alternative today is Lord of the Flies by William Golding. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think that Lord of the Flies is a bad book. But this story about how society breaks down when there are no laws, and especially no law enforcement anymore to keep man's wild and untamed nature in check. This story is so widely received, so well known, and has such a firm place in our collective conscience that it sometimes seems that this is an inevitable outcome. And perversely, in perversion of the criticism contained in this book, this seeming inevitability almost provides an excuse for us to fuck each other over. And this is why I think it's so valuable when a book shows that this is not, in fact, an inevitable outcome of a situation like that, when people are stranded on an island and are in a position where they can do more or less whatever they want. And one of the books that paints a different picture is Where the World Ends by Geraldine McCaughrean. And this is, in fact, based on a true story. This is the story of a group of boys from the Scottish archipelago of St Kilda who get sent on the annual Guga hunt, Gugas being the offspring of gannets, a kind of seabird, and they get sent to that rocky outpost where the birds rear their offspring. And it's always young boys who get sent because they are most apt at climbing the rocks and at getting into small spaces. In the year in which the book is set, which is 1727, the ship that is supposed to pick the group back up after 2 weeks on this rock doesn't come, and the group is stuck on the rock indefinitely without provisions, without shelter, and with only 2 adults to supervise them who are incapable, bordering on dangerous, and worst of all, of course, nobody knows what happened, and the boys begin to think that the whole world might have ended. I've already given you kind of a spoiler as to the outcome of this story, but I think it would be no less of a remarkable read for that. And although this is a children's book or a book for very young adults, I think it would be very educational for anybody who isn't already familiar with the practice of the cougar hunt, which you might be somewhat familiar with if you've read The Black House by Peter May, which is quite a successful Scottish crime novel. But I think I read The Black House after I read this one, and I thought that this one gives you a much better, much more profound insight into this practice. And so even if you have read the Black House and you think that you are familiar with the cougar hunt, I think if you are at all interested in this topic, this would still be a very educational read. Altogether, huge recommendation on my part. I hope that this video has been a little inspirational and maybe given you some perspective if, like me, you've read some of the books that I showed you and were disappointed by them as well. Have you read any of these books, or have you read any of my alternatives? What did you think of them? In any case, I hope you're staying safe and you're reading comforting things. Bye!